An ancestral lobe-finned fish would give rise to the earliest tetrapods. Tetrapod's a word that means 4 limbs or 4 feet. So the sturdy lobe-finned fish ancestor would give rise to a fish that had 4 limbs, so a tetrapod. And so the evidence for this is a transitional organism called Tiktaalik, also referred to as fishapod. And sorry about that typo there. Go ahead and fix that. Tiktaalik, also known as fishapod. And so fishapod's really interesting because it shows traits of both its fish heritage as well as its transition towards a limbed existence. So it has a broad skull and eyes on top, which suggests that it was peering above water. It had lungs like lobe-finned and other fishes had. And then it had pectoral fins that started to have bone structure more like a hand, so finger-like bones. The back of its body was very fish-like, and the front of the body was what was starting to look more like an amphibian. So why would these traits have arisen? Well, this was an organism that was probably living on both land and water. So they were probably accessing food on land, but probably still reproducing in water. And so they were retaining the ability to live in both spaces. In the fossil record, we find this organism around 320 million years ago. And this is what looks very much like a modern amphibian. So tetrapods, this group, this name tetrapod, includes the modern day amphibians. It also includes reptiles and mammals. So we're all considered tetrapods. So where do limbs come from and how do they get changed among different organisms? Remember that the Hox genes came up as a trait important in animal development. And Hox genes are really important for patterning the embryo, so establishing positions in the embryo. And a set of the Hox genes, 9 through 13, are really important in limb formation. And this has been demonstrated in a lot of different experiments where you can show that if you, for example, damage the Hox 10 gene, the affected organism doesn't develop a humerus bone or a humerus part to its limb. So there's a very strong relationship between the sequence of Hox genes being expressed and where these different parts of the limb form. So where Hox 11 is expressed in the embryo, the radius ulna and some of the carpals will be, etc. And so this suggests that modifications of these genes are the likely location of the ways that limbs changed and modified over the course of evolution. And this highlights that sometimes we think that like a limb is a really complex trait. How would you ever genetically get that? Well, because of these really important genes during development, simple mutations in just a couple of genes can make dramatic differences in limb formation. And so it's not as hard to get this so-called complex trait as we think it at first might appear. So tetrapods, again, are the 4 limbs, as we saw with fishapod, is about being able to live on land as well as water. And so this is a big evolutionary step for vertebrates because up until now, organisms are living primarily in water. And so what would drive organisms moving onto land? In other words, what are the benefits? When we're thinking about evolution, we also want to understand the driving forces there. And so as organisms were able to better access land, it may be that they were able to access new food resources, so avoid competition for food, for space. They may have also been able to avoid their predators in water better. And so that may have been why it became advantageous for organisms to be able to be successful on land. Now, remember, organisms didn't choose to go onto land, right? So there wasn't a fish one day that said, gee, I would really like to go hang out on land to avoid this predator. So I guess I'll grow some limbs. Remember, that's not how evolution works. What happens is there was a fish that had slightly better fins at bearing weight. And when it was able to kind of push itself up onto the shore a little bit, it got food, or it was able to avoid a predator, and therefore it was more successful at having offspring. And because it had that trait, its offspring tended to have that trait as well. And then those offspring did really well, maybe better than fish who couldn't bear weight on their limbs. And that happens over many, many, many generations, and that's how you get a new organism that can bear weight on its limbs. So while there was some benefits on land, there was also some challenges that would gradually have to adapt to life on land. So remember, this isn't something that happens overnight. Organisms aren't making this decision, but as organisms become more and more adapted to life on land, they tend to acquire mutations that give them solutions to the challenges on land. So movement, for example, is not just limbs. So limbs are kind of the obvious one. They have to have weight-bearing limbs, but because of gravity, there's just a lot more force pushing down on the bodies of organisms. And so you see other adaptations for dealing with bearing, for example, their organs, right? You have to have a stronger rib cage to bear the weight of the organs if you're not hanging out in water because of gravity. Desiccation, drying out. This is a challenge for all of the tissues. So think eyes and skin, urinary or genital tracts. These are all tissues that in water are constantly being kept moist. But once organisms go onto land, they're going to have to find different ways to deal with this drying out. And so again, organisms that live on land are going to be better at this or worse at this depending on the adaptations they've acquired. And then reproduction, again, unique challenges arise on land. In water, you can assume that if you just let your sperm go, they'll float around and eventually find an egg. Not going to work on land, right? In water, organisms can just leave their eggs in the water and assume their eggs won't dry out. Again, that's not going to work on land, right? The genital tract, the parts, they're going to be drying out. The eggs are going to dry out. So there's going to have to be different solutions for reproduction, and organisms will be either better adapted or less well adapted to reproduction on land. And that's kind of the story that we're going to be building as we look at the different vertebrates, is how well adapted to solving these challenges are they, and what traits help them with these challenges. So we'll take a look at amphibians here first. And so amphibians, the word amphibian has the root amphi, which means like both. And so it's really referring to both water and land. You saw this root in a previous biology class as well. Amphipathic was molecules that were both polar and nonpolar, so loving water and not loving water, or hydrophilic, hydrophobic, is again sharing that same root. So amphibians are organisms that exist in both water and land, like they're adapted to do both things. So they successfully have invaded land, but they have strong ties to water, and one of their strongest ties to water is reproduction. They're going to have some other ways that they're not super well adapted to land, but in particular, reproduction is particularly something they have to go back to the water for. So what are some of their traits? We'll take a look at some of the ones that help them deal with life on land. So the first one is lungs. So remember, lungs are an ancestral trait inherited from a fish. Okay, so that's answering this question down here. This is not a derived character of amphibians. They're not the first ones to have them. Fish are the first ones to have them. But in most fish, the lungs would become the swim bladder. Amphibians retain a true lung that is capable of extracting oxygen from air. Now, one of the things about how they breathe, it's very different from how we breathe. So we are thoracic breathers, and so we have the muscle called the diaphragm that's in our abdomen, and that muscle moves back and forth and creates a bellowing motion that pumps air in and out of our lungs. Amphibians do not have that muscle, so they do not do thoracic breathing. Instead, they do something called buccal pumping. And so this relies on a motion in the back of their throat. And so if you look closely at amphibians, you'll see them kind of do this kind of motion. So if you're seeing my face here, and if you even do that, you kind of will feel it pumping air, right? So they do this weird motion that moves air into their lungs instead. And it's just honestly not as efficient. It's not bringing in as much air. And you could even, feel that if you just experiment with how that feels to do that in your throat. And so they're not as good of breathers as we are, just to put it in simple terms. We are really efficient breathers and they're not. And so they actually need secondary oxygen absorption. they generally absorb oxygen through their skin as well. So we don't do this because we have a tough outer skin. Our tough outer skin doesn't let gases through very efficiently. And that's, again, because it's kind of tough. It's a dry shell. And for us, that's a benefit because it's holding in moisture. But for them, they need that extra oxygen. And so they have to retain a moist skin. So amphibians have a tender skin that generally requires moisture. So you're going to see amphibians generally hanging out in places like next to a pond or in moist soil, somewhere where that skin can stay moist. There's some exceptions to that, but again, that's the general rule. So the disadvantage to that, again, is that they have to be limited to moist areas to keep that skin moist. But again, it's helping them get more oxygen in through their skin. So when we look at their reproduction, they retain external fertilization. So that means that eggs and sperm are deposited outside of the body for development to occur. And so the problem with that is that there has to be water to move the sperm to the egg. And so their reproduction is very strongly tied to water. They have to return to water in order to reproduce. If they're somewhere without a pond, for example, they can't reproduce because there has to be a way for the sperm to get to the egg. In addition to having external fertilization, they also rely on this water environment as the place where their offspring develop. So not only does the egg develop into the embryo, but then they have larval stages that are aquatic. So the larvae actually even look more like a fish, for example, and maybe you've seen a tadpole swimming in a bit of water. A puddle's enough for them. I mean, you can see tadpoles in just little puddles in Aurora, as long as that little puddle's around for a while. And then while they're in that water, they'll go through metamorphosis, which is a change of form. That's what metamorphosis means. That moves them from an aquatic larva into the adult that can live outside of water. And so here we see the eggs of an amphibian. So notice this is in a pond. There's a mass of eggs. The sperm have to get to these eggs, so they're released into the water generally, and they land on the eggs. And then these eggs will develop into tadpoles. And so this is a tadpole. And so notice how much like a fish it looks in the sense that it doesn't have limbs, right? So that's the big thing. There's no limbs here. They have more like a fish tail. The head is a little weird, right? So it's starting to look amphibian-like. And then here's a tadpole near the end stages of metamorphosis. So notice how it now has limbs. And so it's still got the residue of this. It's going to go away eventually, and that's when metamorphosis will be complete for this frog. So this very much limits, this reproductive cycle limits frogs to a moist environment. They have to be somewhere where there's a pond. So you're not going to find them like in the desert. So organisms that are a part of the group Amphibia include frogs and toads, which is order Anura. This is the majority of amphibians, nearly 90% of them. And again, they go through this sort of classic metamorphosis where they have tadpoles that live in water. They're actually herbivorous, which means they feed on plant matter, and then those will metamorphosize into carnivorous adults. Frogs eat things like, flies and insects and stuff like that. There are some other smaller groups of amphibians, and notice here I've used the common names just to help you with your memorization. So Sicilians are rare, blind tropical burrowers. We'll see a picture of them. They almost look like weird worms. They're not worms, but again, they're very strange looking because they don't have legs. And so, okay, how can they be a tetrapod if they don't have legs? Well, remember that oftentimes our groupings are based on evolutionary relationships, and Sicilians actually have an ancestor or had an ancestor with legs. So that's what we mean when we say secondarily legless. Their ancestor had legs, and they went back to not having legs. Salamanders are another one people have heard of. Many of them have really colorful skin patterns. They're known specifically for metamorphosis, where the adult has larval characteristics. So the adult doesn't get rid of things like the tail. So we'll take a look at pictures here. So there's a frog. That's your classic amphibian. Here's a Sicilian where I'm saying, like, okay, they look really weird. Again, if I dug that out of something, I would probably assume it was a worm, but it's not. It's an amphibian. And then here's our salamander retaining. So here's the tail retention of the larval characteristics. So that's our amphibians. These are our tetrapods that still have very strong ties to water.